Now, to go back to your question, was that actually the case? It does seem to be the case that Ibn Mas'ud strongly opposed the Uthmanic codification for a variety of reasons. It might be some ego. He felt that he was left out of the project and he was more deserving of being the person in charge and things like that. And he had this very interesting thing. He told people like "Hullu masahifakum," like conceal your codices. Maybe that's why people buried them or hid them. But and then he quotes the Quran. He quotes a verse. He says, whoever clings to something will rise on the day of judgment with that which they concealed or which they held. And so he really, it really does seem that the Ibn Mas'ud tradition, it kind of was the last bastion in Kufa of non-Uthmanic traditions until it kind of slowly died out. That doesn't mean there were not. Now, of course, there's some people who say, well, this never existed. And this goes back to the Sabat Ahruf. I forgot to mention this earlier. One interpretation of the Sabat Ahruf is that all these reports of companion codices and things like that, they're all wrong. Like they're all false. They're all fabrications. And all the Sabat Ahruf go back to the one Uthmanic text. So that is an opinion out there, which I think I'm very comfortable saying that doesn't seem to be a reflection of reality. And they say, oh, all these other companion readings are just exegesis. They're not actual codices. But then what do you do when someone says, like, I saw with my own eyes, like in this book, this written? Yeah. And then we have the palimpsest, which attests a different textual tradition. So that does seem to be like the wrong opinion. But so to come back, so Ibn Mas'ud seems to have definitely had stuck to his tradition. And okay, so things can get kind of complicated. Why? Because some people point to the legacy of Ibn Mas'ud. So even though his tradition died out, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean his genes died out. So if you think of it in terms of like genetics and DNA, his the Kufan readers, if you look at their readings and you compare the variants in the canonical ones, even compared to the readings of other non-Kufans, you can see traces of Ibn Mas'ud, even though it's been harmonized with the Rasm, with the Uthmanic text, so that it doesn't really deviate. You see traces of the Uthmanic reading left over, wherever it's sort of.
But you mean the not Uthmanic, but the.
That's right, the Ibn Mas'ud tradition. I'm sorry, okay. Yeah, you see remnants of the Ibn Mas'ud. So his lineage lives on. Now, some people will say, well, for example, someone like Hamza, they will say, because part of his lineage goes back to Ibn Mas'ud, that is evidence that Ibn Mas'ud eventually decided to abandon his text and adopt the Uthmanic text. And I think they have it backwards. I think it's that the Ibn Mas'ud tradition was harmonized with the Uthmanic tradition, as opposed to Hamza is a reflection of what Ibn Mas'ud eventually adopted, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I have a lot. There are very good reasons why, and this is part of a discussion in my book. But we'll have to save that for a different time. But I hope that gives you a window into one very interesting question is, how did these reading traditions form? Right. If you think about it, there were other traditions that were non-Uthmanic that were around, and how did they get harmonized with the Uthmanic text? How did they gel? How did they crystallize? So Ibn Mas'ud isn't the only person who had another tradition. There were many other ones, but he was perhaps the most famous. There's another companion by the name of Ubay ibn Ka'b. He had also his own tradition. How does that stuff work its way into the Uthmanic text? I think that's very interesting. And we have reports of other companions also opposing or not liking so this goes into what's politics and what's theology, right? So there's a theological point, which is that this concept of ijma', or consensus, that because the Muslim community has arrived at a consensus of the supremacy or authority of the Uthmanic text, that can be used to make certain historical claims, which I don't agree with. So, for example, there's a report about one of the students of Ibn Mas'ud. His name is Alqama. They travel to Syria, and they run into Abu Darda, who's another companion. And Abu Darda, he says, "Hey, I guess he heard about a group of people coming over from Kufa, and he's like, anyone amongst you from the students of Ibn Mas'ud?" And Alqama, he's like me. And he says, "Hey, how do you read this chapter? It's وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا يَغْشَى." He's like, "How do you read this?" So the guy recites, and he says, وَالذَّكَرِ وَالْأُنْثَى which is different than what's in the Uthmanic text, which is وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنْثَى. And he's like, aha, this is how I learned it from the Prophet. The exact same way. And then he says, وَهَؤُلَاء.
But which one is it that he said he learned from the Prophet?
Ibn Masud, so he agrees with Ibn Masud, right? Okay. So he says, aha, you have confirmed what I know, which is this reading, not the Uthmanic reading. Right. As for those people, هَؤُلَاء, they want me to read وَمَا خَلَقَ الذَّكَرَ وَالْأُنْثَى. They want me to read according to what's in the Uthmanic text. وَاللَّهِ لَا أُتَابِعَهُم. By God, I will never follow them. So he categorically is opposed to following that reading, right? So now the question is, now that really, like, how historical is this narrative? Right. So, one could, depending on like how skeptical you are, one could say that this narrative was constructed by the pro-Ibn Mas'ud people in order to show other companions affirming his reading. So it's like a validation or an affirmation of his reading. And so, I mean, and then you can kind of, this rabbit hole can go on thing, but whether or not you accept it that way, we have reports of other companions either opposing readings in the Uthmanic text, or even like younger companions like Ibn Abbas, actually, instructing his students to not read certain Uthmanic readings and to read this instead. But I think, and I think the salient point is that these different schools kind of die out over time. And what really remains is the Uthmanic tradition.